Camping has always been a cherished tradition in our family, a way to reconnect with nature and each other. This time, we chose a secluded spot near Pine Ridge Mountain in California. The location was perfect, far from the hustle and bustle, nestled in a quiet part of the forest where the main road was a distant memory, and the only foot traffic came from the occasional deer or curious raccoon. The air was crisp and cool as my wife, Lisa, my stepdaughter, Emma, and I arrived and set up our camp. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced among the trees. Pine Ridge Mountain loomed majestically in the background, its peak kissed by the last golden rays of the day. We were alone, completely isolated, and it felt both liberating and slightly eerie. Our campsite was perfect. We pitched our tent on a soft bed of pine needles, the ground firm but comfortable. The paracord straps were taut, securing our temporary home against any unexpected gusts of wind. We gathered wood for a fire, knowing that the warmth and light would be comforting as night fell. After a simple but delicious dinner cooked over the campfire, we settled in for the night. Emma, ever the adventurous spirit, shared ghost stories she had heard from friends at school. Lisa and I laughed, enjoying the innocent thrill of being spooked in the dark woods. The stars above were brilliant, each one a tiny beacon in the vast, inky sky. It was a perfect night. Around midnight, just as we were drifting off to sleep, a sound broke the stillness. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the soft rustling of the leaves. But it grew louder, more deliberate. It was a slow, rhythmic scratching, like nails dragging across a chalkboard, but against the tensioned paracord straps of our tent. The noise was deliberate and persistent. Lisa and I exchanged puzzled glances. "It's probably just a critter," I said, trying to reassure both her and myself. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But something about the sound felt wrong. It was too slow, too deliberate. Most animals would scratch quickly, as if they had somewhere else to be. This was different. The rhythm was almost mechanical, and it seemed to echo in the quiet night air. We lay still, listening. The noise continued, moving around the tent. I felt a chill run down my spine. There were no other sounds, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, just that eerie scratching. Whatever it was, it moved with an unsettling silence, as if it were floating. Emma, thankfully, was fast asleep, unaware of the growing tension. Lisa and I, however, were on high alert. We listened as the scratching moved from one corner of the tent to another, closer to our heads. We could feel the vibrations reverberating through the floor of the tent. It was unnerving. "Maybe we should check it out," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, though I wasn't keen on the idea. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver through me. I stepped outside, scanning the perimeter of our campsite. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no signs of an animal. I circled the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching had stopped the moment I stepped outside. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing mind. Perhaps it really was just a small animal, scared away by the light. But the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. When I returned to the tent, Lisa's worried expression mirrored my own. "Anything?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nothing. Let's just try to get some sleep." Maybe it was nothing, but sleep was elusive. The scratching resumed around 2 a.m., this time louder and more insistent. It moved faster, shifting from one corner to another with unnerving precision. We lay there, wide awake, as the sound seemed to surround us. There was no way it was an animal. The rhythm, the intensity, it felt almost otherworldly. Finally, around 4 a.m., the noise stopped. Exhaustion overcame our fear, and we drifted into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by the first light of dawn. The sun's rays pierced through the tent, casting a warm glow that felt almost unreal after the night we had endured. We emerged from the tent, bleary-eyed and tense. The forest around us was peaceful, the morning air fresh and crisp. Birds chirped cheerfully, and the previous night's terror seemed like a distant memory. But Lisa and I couldn't shake the unease. We needed answers. As the morning progressed, we tried to enjoy our camping trip. Emma, with her boundless energy, was eager to explore the woods and find adventure. We couldn't dampen her spirits with our fears, so we joined her on a hike, hoping that daylight would banish the night's horrors. We walked along a trail that wound through the forest, the path covered in fallen leaves and flanked by towering trees. The beauty of Pine Ridge Mountain was undeniable, and for a while, we managed to push aside our concerns. Emma led the way, her laughter echoing through the trees as she discovered interesting rocks and plants. But Lisa and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, set our nerves on edge. We tried to rationalize our fear, but the memory of that scratching sound was too vivid. After a few hours, we returned to camp for lunch. As we sat around the fire, I noticed something odd. The paracord straps on our tent had deep, even scratches, as if made by sharp claws. I showed Lisa, and we exchanged worried glances. This was no small animal. "We need to figure out what's going on," Lisa said, her voice firm. "We can't just ignore this." I agreed. That afternoon, we set up a small camera outside the tent, hoping to capture any unusual activity. As the sun set and darkness enveloped the forest once again, we gathered around the fire, trying to stay positive for Emma's sake. We told more stories, sang songs, and roasted marshmallows, but the tension was palpable. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more aggressive. We huddled together in the tent, listening as it moved around us, coming closer and closer. I glanced at the camera's red recording light, praying it would capture whatever was tormenting us. The sound seemed to go on forever, a relentless, nerve-wracking assault. Just as it had the previous night, it stopped abruptly around 4 a.m. We didn't sleep at all, too terrified to close our eyes. As dawn broke, we rushed to check the camera. My hands trembled as I rewound the footage and hit play. The screen showed our tent, the surrounding trees, and the dark shadows of the night. At first, everything seemed normal, but then, at midnight, the scratching began. The camera's microphone picked up the sound clearly, sending chills down my spine. The footage showed the tent shaking slightly with each scratch, but there was nothing visible outside. No animals, no movement, just that relentless noise. And then, at 2 a.m., something flickered on the screen. A shadowy figure, tall and indistinct, moved quickly past the camera, too fast to make out any details. We watched in horror as the figure circled the tent, its movements unnatural and fluid. It paused occasionally, as if observing us, before resuming its eerie pacing. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. Lisa and I were speechless. What had we captured? It was unlike anything we had ever seen. We showed the footage to Emma, who was equally disturbed. We needed help, and we needed it fast. I called a friend who was an experienced outdoorsman and familiar with the local wildlife. He agreed to come out and investigate, arriving later that morning with his own equipment. We replayed the footage for him, and his reaction was one of disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "It doesn't move like any animal I know. And that sound, it's just not natural." Together, we scoured the campsite for any clues. We found more scratches on the paracord, deep and deliberate. There were no footprints, no signs of any creature. It was as if whatever it was had left no trace. That night, with our friend keeping watch, we tried to get some rest. The scratching returned, but this time, our friend was ready. He shone a powerful flashlight around the campsite, but saw nothing. The sound persisted, relentless and mocking. We spent the next few days in a state of high alert, the constant tension wearing us down. The scratching never stopped, always starting at midnight and ending at 4 a.m. We were exhausted, scared, and desperate for answers. Finally, we decided to leave. Camping was supposed to be a relaxing escape, but this experience had turned it into a nightmare. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever was out there was glad to see us go. Back home, we reviewed the footage again and again, but found no new clues. The shadowy figure remained a mystery, the scratching an unsolved riddle. We shared our story with friends and family, hoping someone might have an explanation, but no one did. If there's one thing I've always loved, it's the thrill of camping, especially when surrounded by good friends. It takes the edge off, you know? The kind of edge that creeps up on you when it's dark outside and the wilderness begins to whisper all around your tent. This story I'm about to tell you, it happened about 10 years ago. I was just 16 then, a typical teenager with a penchant for adventure, always ready to dive into the mysteries of the wild with my buddies, Jake and Chris. We had our sights set on this prime camping spot we knew in the rural depths of Virginia. It wasn't just any spot. It was our secret haven, tucked away in the woods, complete with a flat patch of grass perfect for a tent and far removed from the trappings of city life. Getting there was a bit of a trek. We'd start on this dirt trail that meandered through the forest for a couple of miles. At a certain point, you'd have to veer off the path and navigate down a steep hill, overgrown and barely visible. If you didn't know better, you'd miss it entirely from the trail above. The beauty of this place was its isolation. It lay a good distance from any roads, houses, or streetlights, providing that exhilarating feeling of being completely self-reliant, just us and nature, with no modern distractions. That particular trip started off great. We arrived early in the afternoon, set up our tent, and had a fire roaring by dusk. The crackle of the fire was our soundtrack as we cooked a hearty meal, filling the clearing with the rich, smoky scent of barbecued meats. As night enveloped us, we gathered around the fire, diving into the sort of conversations that seemed profound under the starlit sky, dreams, fears, and the wild speculations of teenage minds. It must have been around 1 a.m. when our light-hearted banter was cut short by a peculiar sight. Two lights appeared on the trail, close together like eyes piercing through the darkness. At first, we joked it might be someone holding torches, or perhaps the glow of an animal's eyes caught in a distant beam. But as we watched, a chill settled over us. The lights seemed too steady, too controlled, and a fearful thought struck us. Could it be the police? After all, in our youthful defiance, we hadn't secured permission for the fire, and the last thing we needed was to get busted. The lights hovered, unblinking, casting long shadows that twisted through the trees. Our laughter died down as the lights began to move, inching closer with an eerie slowness. Panic spurred us into the tent, our hearts hammering against our chests. We zipped ourselves in, holding our breaths, listening for any sign of movement. But the night grew quiet again, eerily so, and eventually, our adrenaline faded into restless sleep. The next morning brought more questions than answers. We woke to find the tent flap open, an unsettling reminder of the night's fears. None of us remembered getting up, and we were certain we had secured it before falling asleep. Outside, the grass told tales of disturbances, with trails leading down from the hill. We scoured the area but found nothing to explain who, or what, might have visited our campsite. Since then, I've continued to embrace the call of the wild, sometimes even venturing out alone. I've never let the mystery of that night deter me from my explorations, though I always make sure to carry a handheld light. There's something about the unknown that doesn't scare me as much anymore. Instead, it invites me to delve deeper, always wondering what lies just beyond the reach of the campfire light. As I grew older, the memory of that night didn't fade, but rather, it evolved into a sort of legend among my friends and me. We'd often recount the story around new campfires, each retelling adding a layer of mystique to our shared experience. Despite the unnerving aspects, it bonded us in ways that only shared secrets can. It became our tale of the unknown, our brush with the inexplicable. I've returned to that same spot several times since that night, each visit wrapped in a mix of nostalgia and a slight thrill at the prospect of encountering those mysterious lights again. But, as is often the way with such things, the woods remain just woods, beautiful and serene, offering no further hints of the supernatural, or whatever it had been that stirred the underbrush and unzipped our tent all those years ago. Yet, with each camping trip, whether with friends or alone, I make it a point to venture a little further into the wilderness, to explore paths not taken and hills not climbed. My gear grew more sophisticated over the years. The simple handheld light was replaced by high-tech gear suited for a variety of scenarios: thermal imaging for wildlife observation, a better tent, and always a reliable GPS. But it's not just the gear that changed. I did too. The wilderness taught me respect, not just for nature, but for the mysteries it holds. It taught me to enjoy the serenity that comes from being disconnected from the world and immersed in the simple, raw realities of nature. It taught me to listen, not just to the sounds of the forest, but to the inner voice that had grown more confident with each solo trip. It was on one of these solo trips, several years after the incident, that I finally felt the full circle of my journey begin to close. I had hiked further than usual, pushing myself to explore a densely wooded area that was rumored to be home to various wildlife. As dusk fell and I prepared my campsite, the familiarity of the routine brought a sense of peace. The fire crackled just like it did that night, and I settled in, wrapped in a blanket beside it. That's when I saw it again, the faint glow of lights on the trail. My heart skipped a beat, not in fear, but in anticipation. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the trail, determined to confront whatever it was. As I approached, the lights flickered, and for a moment, I hesitated. Was I ready to face this chapter of my past? The lights weren't steady as they had been before. They moved with a natural rhythm, like someone, or something, walking with a lantern. I quickened my pace, rounding a bend, and there it was, a hiker, an older man with a weather-beaten face, his lantern swinging gently in his hand. We stood there for a moment, staring at each other across the twilight divide. He smiled, a warm, friendly gesture that belied the tension of my approach. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he said, his voice rough but kind. It was then I realized how far I had come. The fear that once gripped me had transformed into curiosity, and now, a sense of camaraderie with another soul braving the wilds at night. "Yes, it is," I replied, returning his smile. We talked for a few minutes, sharing our reasons for being out there. He was a local, someone who found peace in the night hikes, just as I found my adventures by day. As we parted ways, I felt a profound sense of relief and completeness. The mystery that had haunted me was resolved, not with a dramatic revelation, but with the simple understanding that sometimes the things we fear can be the doorways to greater understanding and connection. Back at my campfire, I reflected on all the years, all the trips, and all the miles I had traveled, both outwardly and within myself. The wilderness, with all its mysteries and challenges, had taught me more than I could have imagined. Not just about survival, but about living fully, embracing the unknown, and finding connections in unexpected places. And as the fire dwindled to embers, I knew that no matter where life took me, the call of the wild, the call to explore, to understand, to connect, would always be a part of who I am. Not more than a week or two ago, I took to the dense woods behind Cedar Ridge, my small hometown nestled in the heart of Oregon. With fewer than 1,000 souls, it's a place where everyone knows your name, and the wilderness is a backyard we all share but seldom explore deeply. The woods, expansive and serene, are flat with no rise of hills or mountains, yet are ribboned with ponds and small rivers that beckon the adventurous at heart. On that particular morning, the idea was simple. Head to a river I'd been to a few times, but never had the opportunity to camp at before. From what I remembered, it was about a 3-hour walk due north, a trek through unmarked terrain that promised solitude and a break from the grind of daily life. With my backpack loaded and my hiking boots laced, I set off. The forest greeted me with its usual quiet, the kind of silence punctuated only by bird calls and the rustle of leaves stirred by unseen creatures. It was an open woods scenario. There were no beaten paths where I was headed, only the faint traces of animal tracks that one could barely call trails. The air was crisp, the kind of freshness you only get from being surrounded by ancient trees and untrodden ground. I moved with ease, knowing the land well enough to navigate without a compass. About 45 minutes from my destination, my tranquility was unexpectedly shattered. Someone else was here. We saw each other almost simultaneously. He emerged from between the trees, a mere few feet away, and we both halted, our mutual surprise mirroring the others. My heart thudded oddly in my chest, not out of fear initially, but out of the sheer oddity of encountering another human in such a secluded spot. The man looked as bewildered as I felt, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes, wide and searching, eventually formed a nervous smile before he abruptly turned and walked away, almost as if he regretted being seen. I watched him go, his pace quickening until he was nearly running through the trees. The encounter left me with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake off, the kind that crawls up your spine and whispers warnings you can't quite articulate. I shrugged off the discomfort. I had a river to get to and a night under the stars to enjoy, or so I thought. Arriving at the riverbank, I set up camp on a flat patch of land near the water's edge. The sun was tipping towards the horizon, bathing the forest in golden light that flickered through the leaves. I gathered wood for a fire, a task that felt grounding after the earlier disruption. As twilight approached, I managed to get a decent fire going, the flames casting playful shadows around my campsite. Settling beside my small fire, I planned to spend the night stargazing. The Milky Way is a sight to behold in these parts, away from the light pollution of the city. As darkness enveloped the woods, The stars began to peek out, one by one. A celestial show that never failed to awe me. Hours passed in a peaceful reverie until a distinct sound broke the silence. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The steps seemed cautious, measured, as if whoever caused them was trying to be silent. I reached for my flashlight, a heavy-duty one that could light up a decent stretch of the forest. Shining it around, I scanned the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was now complete, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Heart racing, I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. The quiet mocked me. Compelled by a mix of fear and the need to know, I ventured towards the source of the sound. With each step, I felt the isolation of the woods press in on me. The flashlight's beam became my only comfort, a small circle of light in the overwhelming darkness. As I moved the light from side to side, it suddenly illuminated a figure, the same man from earlier. He was standing still, barely 20 feet away, his eyes caught in the flashlight's glow but his body unmoving, almost as if he were a statue. In a split second, I had to make a choice. Pretend I hadn't seen him? Confront him? My instinct screamed at me to keep it cool, to act as if nothing was amiss. I slowly moved the beam away from him and continued my scan of the woods before turning back towards my camp. My mind raced with questions about his intentions and my safety. Picking up my pace, I returned to my tent, packed up with shaking hands, and without extinguishing the fire, I started walking, then running, back towards town, not once looking back. The stars were obscured by the canopy as I fled, and the once comforting sounds of the forest now seemed sinister, each crack and rustle a potential threat. When I finally stopped, it was out of sheer exhaustion, far enough that I hoped I was safe, but still haunted by the fear of being followed. The night was long, spent in vigilance until the first light of dawn allowed me to make my way out of the woods without further incident. The relief of reaching the town was palpable, but the shadows of what had happened stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the unknowns that lay hidden in the seemingly tranquil forest. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, the early light brought a semblance of normalcy, but the events of the night lingered like a dark stain on my mind. I hadn't just escaped. I had fled from a threat that remained as mysterious as it was unsettling. Walking back into town, the familiar streets felt alien, as if the shadows of the forest had followed me home. Back in my own house, the first thing I did was secure every lock and glance through each window, a ritual that seemed both necessary and absurd in the light of day. The town was waking up, untroubled and peaceful, unaware of the drama that had unfolded just a few miles away in the dark woods. After a shower and a strong cup of coffee, the adrenaline that had fueled my escape began to ebb, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But sleep was elusive. Every small noise was a footstep, every shadow a figure standing still. I was safe, home, yet the safety felt tenuous. As the day stretched on, I wrestled with what to do next. The logical part of me wanted to dismiss the night's events as a product of overactive imagination fueled by isolation and darkness. Yet, the vivid memory of the man's stare, the deliberate silence after my calls, the unnerving encounter, all painted a picture too real to ignore. I needed answers, or at the very least, to share my experience. I headed to the local sheriff's office, a small brick building tucked between the town's diner and the post office. Inside, Sheriff Langston, a man who had served the community for more years than I'd been alive, greeted me with a nod. "Morning," "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing the bags under my eyes and the tense set of my shoulders. I told him everything. The hike, the man in the woods, the unnerving chase, my midnight escape. He listened, his expression unreadable, then sighed deeply. "I was hoping we wouldn't have more trouble," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "You're not the first to report odd things happening out there. We've had a few folks come in with stories about being watched, followed even. It's always the same part of the woods." His words sent a chill down my spine. Others had experienced this too? "We've been keeping an eye on the area, increasing patrols when we can, but you know how vast those woods are. Finding someone who doesn't want to be found, well, it's a needle in a haystack scenario," Sheriff Langston explained. I left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers. The idea that this wasn't an isolated incident, that others had felt the same oppressive terror, was both a validation and a deepening of my unease. What was happening in the woods of Cedar Ridge? Days passed, and the edges of my fear began to dull, blunted by routine and the comforting bustle of small-town life. Yet, the pull of the unknown tugged at me. I couldn't let it go. I needed to understand, to find some semblance of closure, not just for myself, but for others who had felt the same fear. With cautious determination, I began my own investigation. I spent days poring over local archives and online forums, reaching out to those who had shared similar experiences. Each story was a piece of a puzzle, and the picture that was emerging was complex and unnerving. Compelled by a growing sense of responsibility, I organized a group of volunteers from the town, hikers and hunters familiar with the wilderness, supported unofficially by Sheriff Langston's deputies. We set out to sweep the area, to find any clue that might explain the presence in the woods. Our search was thorough, spanning several weekends. We combed through the dense underbrush, across the silent rivers, and under the ancient boughs where sunlight seldom reached. It was on one such expedition, deep in the heart of the woods, that we found it. An abandoned campsite so old it was nearly reclaimed by the forest. Among the detritus of a long-gone presence, we found scraps of clothing, canned food rusted and swollen, and chillingly, a series of makeshift traps that spoke of survival skills and a desire to avoid detection. The discovery was unsettling, a tangible proof that someone had been living off the grid, watching, waiting. We reported everything to the sheriff, and the site became the center of a more official investigation. Months went by, the seasons changed, and the chill of autumn swept through Cedar Ridge. The mystery of the woods remained just that, a mystery, albeit one now recognized and respected by the townsfolk. Signs went up at trailheads, warning hikers to stay vigilant, to hike in groups. The woods no longer felt like an open invitation, but a place to respect, to approach with caution. As for me, I still hike, still feel the call of the wild spaces that surround Cedar Ridge. But I never go alone, and I always tell someone where I'm going. The woods are beautiful, haunting, filled with the unknown. I've learned to respect that, to accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only acknowledged. In the heart of Cedar Ridge, the woods whisper and watch, and we, its people, tread lightly, with eyes wide open, forever changed by the shadows we've seen.